Hello, everyone's joining. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 736th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Baseera Khan and Zoë Hopkins. We are thrilled to welcome poet Manal Kara here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. And here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. So sorry, just give me one moment. My screen cut out here. So we have today Baseera Khan with us, and Baseera Khan is a New York-based performance, sculpture, and installation artist who makes work to discuss materials and their economies, labor, family structures, religion, and spiritual well-being. And our host today is Zoë Hopkins. Writer Zoë Hopkins studies art history and African American studies at Harvard University. Her writing has appeared in Hyperallergic, The Brooklyn Rail, Art Forum, and White Hot, Magazine of Contemporary Art. Thank you all so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Zoë.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for the introduction. Thrilled to be here this afternoon with Baseera. How are you today?
Doing well.
Good.
Happy to be here too.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. I think this is just going to be fun and good vibes. So first of all, congratulations on what has been a very busy and fulsome year for you. In 2022, you had a show at the Brooklyn Museum, you had a show at the Moody Arts Center in Texas, which has now moved to the Cincinnati Center for Contemporary Arts, and you have a show at Georgetown University. So I don't know how you're doing it all. Very impressed and bewildered to be in your presence and to be having this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We also have some of the works that were up at the Brooklyn Museum that traveled to Sharjah Foundation, and that work got picked up by a really prominent museum in New Delhi, so it traveled to India. It's the first time I've been able to show this particular work in quote unquote Islamic states, and so, well, obviously India is not Islamic, but it's a really special moment for me to be able to crash test all of these ideas in spaces where you don't necessarily need education to understand the work, even though in America, like, I'm so multi-layered with my work that, you know, there's one gateway to my work that you can understand, or you don't understand. You can go around and go through another path to understand my work. So I think that artists' works are legible no matter what. You don't necessarily need an education for it, is the point.
Right, but there's a sense of the groundwork already being there, I guess, is just sort of what you're saying.
Right, Zoe, like the lived experience is such that there's a particular doorway that most Americans aren't a part of, right? Like most Americans don't even know how to say Muslim, they say Muslim.
Oh, what a mess. What a mess. I wanted to ask first about the Moody Arts Center / Cincinnati Contemporary Arts Center exhibition, specifically its title, Weight on History. I'm really curious about this idea of weight as a sort of capacious and multivalent word. There's the weight of the body, there's the weight of the forms that you're dealing with in this exhibition, many of which are very sort of monumental and architectural and heavy. And then I also had somehow convinced myself that the title of the exhibition was weight of history rather than weight on history until like yesterday, which was, I don't know, an interesting Freudian slip on my behalf. But yeah, I wanted to kind of dive into this title and how we might approach it as a point of entry for thinking about some of the thematics that this exhibition is dealing with, or your body of work more broadly.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about titles.
Yeah.
Because it's like the one written signature or index that a person has access to, right? Before they kind of go into a space that's filled with like the legacy of visuality and like human experience, which is super abstract. So it's like a key for them to hold while they're observing this world. And for me, I think the best way to describe these titles, especially the titles of the shows, is that early on in 2017, when I did my first solo show at Participant Inc., which is a performance space in the Lower East Side, I chose to do a project called Misspelled on Purpose. So it became like a reading room on purpose. And it was like this, like kind of vast acrylic arabesque cubed space with all these books that I was forced to read or that I was happy to read in grad school and undergrad. And they were augmented by the books that Leah Gadgetano, the founder of the space, had also influenced me with. And so it became like this space where we could like look at the show and then come and sit and like observe what's in my mind and all the different ideas that came together for me. At the top of this acrylic box was a pair of shoes that I made from this Nike dashboard, where you, at the time when you could make your own shoe at the Nike Corporation. And I misspelled the word Muslim and I said, I am Muslima. I crunched it together, kind of like what you do when you're doing a text message on Twitter or whatnot, because we are living in a culture where you thrive off of misspelling words. You give it a like a very different kind of spice when you use a Z or a Y or an A, or you add an extra O, you know, like this is the way you can get closer to emotion without using an emoji because an emoji is a visual set. And sometimes I think when people are misspelling words, they're trying to like break out of the social norm of the smiley face or of the eggplant or what have you, right? And so we're doing these things unconsciously to try to find freedoms, even in the small day-to-day stuff. And so for me, the title is definitely about weight as in heaviness, but it's also about, you know, the word has it, how it sounds in your head is also WAIT. Okay. And so when you say weight on history, for me, it was sort of initially a positive thing because I'm actually here talking to you, Zoë Hopkins, because we sort of just were stubborn and we're waiting on history. And now all these doors are opening for us in places where the doors were never for us. So we're sort of like making the threshold and the gateway possible through our knowledge and through our experience. And it's necessary to move forward. All of us in this room are necessary to move forward. So on that level, like just simply waiting in terms of time, like was an important read for me too with the title.
Right.
On top of like, go ahead.
I was also just going to add, I mean, weight implies a sense of pressure, as if to wait on time is also wait on time in the temporal sense is also to apply pressure onto history, to force it to mold to your will in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good title because I think the sculptures are sort of made from materials that appear heavy, but when you actually go up to it, you experience its transparency and its weightlessness. And so things are just very confusing. Like I'm hoping that you're always on your toes when you're looking at the work, and there's always another layer to explore.
Yes, yeah. And I wanted to ask about that kind of dance between transparency and opacity, or between solidness and hollowness, that is very much at work in this exhibition, and other areas of your work. We're looking right now at one of, to give some context, this work is a Corinthian column, essentially, right? Or based on the architecture of a Corinthian column, but the interior has been cut out. But what I love is this gesture of the glass insert, which
it's
makes
not glass, it's scrim.
Oh, it's not glass.
It's scrim.
What is it?
It's scrim. You know, Robert
Oh.
Irwin, I'm sure there's some art historians in here, including yourself. Robert, like the material that Robert Irwin's mostly known to use in his minimalist sculptures, it's scrim. Anyway, go ahead.
But that's so interesting. I mean, I have obviously thought I was tricked, but what this does is, for me at least, it plays a trick where it sort of calls attention to the transparency of the thing, but adds a layer of opacity just in being a kind of material that your eye has to work through. And so it's very different than leaving the middle of this interior totally empty. But it sort of refers to that emptiness, emphasizes that emptiness in a way. And then in your work, Painful Arc, which I think is somewhere in these slides. I don't know if it's possible.
I want to double back before we switch off to Painful Arc, which is a gateway. What you're seeing right now is that the use of the scrim, and I'm so happy that you said glass, because I immediately was like, wow, that would have been badass to use glass. But then the whole point of the object is weightlessness. Like I'm a small person, and I'm body lifting right now, and I still haven't quite got to lifting my own body weight because it takes a lot of effort, right? But I'll get to that place very soon, don't worry. But I'm really interested in making monumental pieces that are obtainable for me to move if I have to. And so some of the choices I make are about weightlessness, but then in this particular case, not choosing something heavy like resin or glass was about reinforcing the idea of propness, the idea that it's a prop, and scrim is something used in film and stage theater, whatnot, to present a space that may or may not be there. And I feel that these ideas that are imbibed in architectural features like Corinthian columns or gateways or what have you, there's an implied gesture of ownership, and that ownership is old, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's about power, right? And there's this kind of like chokehold on ways of being, and there's nothing you can do about it. Like the column is there. If you take the column off, the roof is going to fall. You don't want that, do you? No. Okay, so let's keep that column there. And so I feel like I'm trying to constantly find materials and legacies of visuality or visual experience that are doing that work for me, so that I don't necessarily have to explain what it feels like to live under the scrutiny of policies and ways of being that weren't made for me. They weren't made for you. Right. And they're not made for anyone, because we're living in a world now where like the white family across the line of the red line district is now suffering, whereas the black family was suffering maybe like 40 years ago. They're doing okay now, and now it's the opposite. So now we have this like tables are turning scenario in this country in terms of economics. But if we had all just worked together from the beginning, from the get, like maybe we'd all have a little piece of the pie. Anyway, I know that I'm just speaking and spitting, but that's kind of where it's coming from.
No, I mean, you're right. Like if we didn't have an aesthetics that is so invested in modeling power and announcing power and articulating itself around its own heaviness, what kind of world do we live in?
Yeah.
And I think something that's interesting to me about these columns is not only the hollowness, but also the very obvious gesture, fragmentation that's happening here, and the extent to which, I don't know, for me, there's a kind of like radical defamiliarization that occurs when I see something that I think of as solid, as capable of holding something up, fragmented and laid on the floor like that, or fragmented and kind of arced against the wall, almost mimicking the presentation of a painting, since we're in a gallery space. So there are these geometries of defamiliarization as well, that I think articulate power differently, or deconstruct power through that fragmentation of these, devices of architectural kind of hegemony. I also wanted to ask about the what's going on the outside of these columns, and this gesture of covering that surfaces again and again in your work, layering patterns on top of things that are associated with, particularly in the case of the Corinthian column, it's associated with, classical idealism and with, the unity of the object. What does it do when you put a pattern on top of it?
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways I can answer it. When I was learning about art history sort of happened to me through architecture, because I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in a particular place in Texas, in Dallas, where there's a lot of oil money and a lot of land. And there were a lot of patrons of the arts. And so I experienced all of Walter Gropius like community, the idea of like one of the highest scholars of architecture were coming to the area in which I was growing up to build and erect these amazing buildings that hold some of the most profound artworks in the world, right? You have like Tato Undo and Louis Kahn and, Renzo Piano. Like, they're all these architects that were building homes for art. And I witnessed those things just by like doing family trips, always being on the highways, going to see families in small little towns, or like schools having nothing else to show you, but they just put you in a school bus and take you to like the Fort Worth Modern, so you can see like a little model scale of what their ambitions were. And one of which was, I watched these twice. I watched Richard Serra's get care flighted in, kind of like a Fellini film, and dropped onto the campuses of these like modern art museums. And that for me was like, I was educated in a way visually where I was already thinking about Islamic theology that has a minimalist aesthetic to it. And then here I am looking at like high art with a capital A, and there's like minimal aesthetic to it. So by the time I started understanding the lingua franca of art, and like I was studying painting, but I was always looking at other things other than painting.
Right.
Because of the sheer nature of what I was around. And so fast forward to when I was older, I started learning about warm conceptualism and like Felix Gonzalez Torres and like all these artists who, could still be with us if the world was different, and how they managed to like insert themselves into a legacy of art that was clinical and austere, and they warmed it up because they were different, because they had layers to their thought process. This, not to like fray, but like coming from the like educational background I come from, I studied global aesthetics. And so, Aimé Césaire went through this too, when he was trying to get the French government to understand that Marxism in Africa looked different. Marxism in the Caribbean looked different than Marxism in France. And he literally wrote a resignation letter, right? So in a sense, like for me, the way that I work, I'm thinking already that like Aimé Césaire was a warm conceptualist minimalist artist, like, because he was like adding warmth and texture to a thing that was supposed to be purely one thing, and it never was. Like, for me, Richard Serra is the pinnacle of identity-based art, because he was making objects based off of his family's history and connection to the industrial revolution and industrial industries, the industries of metal. So, his dad, for example, he was making art for his dad. So going back to the question, I was looking at these Corinthian columns, and I wanted to wrap semblances of my culture, semblances of other powerful visual forms around this imperial visual form. So I'm wrapping Kashmiri rugs that were handmade for me for this particular project around these Corinthian columns, because I'm, as I say, I'm wrapping power with power. They're just different kinds of power, One's like lateral, right? It's like on the floor, it grounds you. It's fecund with like these like flora and fauna from the region, right? It's dyed from the plants from the region. It has a history to it. A lot of these plants don't exist anymore because of global warming and all the conflict. So, you're standing on history. And so I wanted to take, and in another way, like these ruins, these columns, they're powerful. They come from like, generations and generations of like this, that, and the third. And they still live out in all these different places in the world as these Corinthian columns and these ruins. So I'm taking these two histories and I'm putting them together. And at first I was like, I'm crazy, I'm psychotic, why am I doing this? But it makes a lot of sense because of the way the world is going.
It does. And I'm really enamored by this idea of wrapping one kind of power with another. And also how that allows us to articulate that power is not one thing. Power is available in many different forms and many different motifs and patterns. And the rugs too brings me neatly to another kind of facet of your work, and another kind of area of this show at the Moody Arts Center, which is now in Cincinnati, actually. But these prayer rugs that are hanging on the wall, that you have referred to as psychedelic prayer rugs, which I love as a a modifier. But I wanted to ask about what it means to when these lateral forms of power become vertical, and what happens when they're placed on the wall to recall that kind of vocabulary of painterly installation. What kind of transition happens there?
You are good. You're really good. You're really good at this. Yeah. So no, I mean, one of the things I'm excited about with the question is that I reoriented like the orientation of things, right? So the lateral power versus the vertical power. So I did that with another work, which you have in your slideshow called The Seats, but we'll talk about that when you're ready. A lot of what happens, I would love to create the illusion of the mastermind, but I'd be doing myself a disservice to to create the illusion that I'm always ahead of the game. A lot of the things that happen to me with my artwork are just based on lived experiences. And, you know, like even with the Nike shoe, that shoe wasn't meant to be an artwork. It was a way for me to take back the power of the high school students that I was teaching photography with, because they were constantly on the Nike site, like disrupting the classroom, making their shoe while I was trying to teach them the power of the photograph, right? And
Classic.
so, it was so classic. And so I ended up converting the whole class around the shoe and doing the series of images around the shoe. And then for my opening at Participant 2017, I was like, they're all coming to see me perform, and they're going to be so impressed with the show and my performance. And I'm going to wear that shoe. I'm going to show, because some of these kids can't afford this shoe, but I'm going to take back power here by wearing this really fancy shoe that I made for myself. And so I was really just trying to look like a diva that night by wearing this Nike shoe that I made by myself. And then all of a sudden I got thwarted into a boycott, and like, oh, wait, why does Nike think that Islam and Muslim is like necessarily going to create violence if you embroider that onto a shoe? And, you know, this, that, and the third. So I wanted to take the time to say that, because there are just things that happen to me while I'm working with installations, or, you know, when I'm trying to get a material from one place to the other, or work with somebody, that I have to problem solve a lot of psychological things. And so that leads me to what the work is, because the work is telling me what it is. And so for a very long time, I was trying to have these psychedelic rugs be these spaces of vertical power on the ground, where you can really like think about sovereignty and, like, you know, demonstration histories and what have you, and like really get into the mind of what psychedelia is. It's about transcending yourself. It's about imagination. It's about like accessing parts of your brain that you don't necessarily have access to, because we're conditioned to like think about things in a social form. So sometimes people have to drop the pill in order to like have the energy and the courage to like access these pockets of hidden secrets and imagination in our mind, right? That's what psychedelia is. And so for these rugs, the meditation and the kinds of like imagination that can happen when you're on the ground and you're rooted on the ground kind of had to stop, because people kept walking all over it. And I didn't want people to have to take their shoes off to engage, because I don't want to control people's bodies. And at some point I was like, hey, okay, fine. Let's just take this rug, because there's a precedence for it. Let's take this rug and place it in the northeast, you know, spaces and vantage points of whatever the space is. So that was the second iteration of it. So it went from the floor into the northeast corner of whatever the space is onto the wall. And then now it kind of is just doing whatever, because like now it's just like, it has a kind of value to it, where like I feel like when people see the work, they know what's happening and they know the orientation and the history of it. So I feel like it's okay wherever it is now. It'll hold that. But going back to why switch the orientation, sorry, I had gotten a call. Going back to why switch the orientation, it's really like when you're thinking about painting, because you're evoking painting quite a bit in our conversation, like even with the sculptures of the snakeskin or second skin columns on the wall. When you're looking at a sculpture, you're really thinking about its three-dimensional form and its objectivity. But once you place it on the wall, there's a precedence, like in the visual languages of painting, where it becomes the gaze. And for me, that's really interesting to now look at these rugs and see and ask questions of comfort, and ask questions of like, am I looking at the rug, or is the rug looking back at me? And this is something that I like learned quickly when I was reading Ray Chow. Like if anybody is like curious about expanding on that thought process, there's a scholar, R.E.Y. Chow, that talked a lot about the complexities of the gaze. And for me, these kinds of lenses or portals are like super important to evoke, because it's about transformativity and like reimagining something.
You're also bringing me back to 5 minutes ago when we were talking about minimalism, and you spoke about psychedelia in relation to transcendence, which is also a word that is often used to describe the experience of a minimalist painting. Like you look at it and it somehow you transcend your own body. The painting transcends this, temporal spatial domain that it exists in, and the whole thing has to transcend politics and the real world and whatever. But these rugs are not at all trying to do that. I mean, on the one hand, you do have this experience of opticality that, kind of is attuned to the experience of looking at a painting, and you do have this dimension of transcendent psychedelia, but they're also pointing very directly to, a specific experience. And you even have one that this I am a body. I presume that that's meant to evoke the sanitation workers strike sign, I am a man, which has been reinterpreted by Glenn Ligon and again by Hank Willis Thomas and again and again and again. I can't honestly make out I'm as good as you are. Is that what this one says? Yes. But these textual kind of interpolations that are happening here, I'm also interested in, and the kind of discursive frame that your work is occupying, which, we spoke about earlier when we in my first question about titles. But what would you say the role of textuality as it is operating in your work is? We talked about how it's operating on your work through titles, but what about when it's actually present in the
well, I think of words are so powerful, and the sticks and stones, you get over those bruises and, the physical visceralness of pain. You get over it, but the words stick with you. And that's so elemental to say. But for me, when I come up with a string of words that mean something, I'm kind of evoking a mantra. And when I was looking at these rugs and making these rugs, somehow this particular object, this found object, a prayer rug, became a symbol of peace, justice, and revival. People from all walks of life were bringing them to airports to like make sure that their loved ones came home. During like the demonstrations and protests, they reappeared during a lot of the uprising in 2020. They're becoming something outside of theological constraints of the religion itself. Okay, just like the cross. I mean, like, I'm sorry, like when Metallica wears a cross, I don't think that they're actually thinking about God. They're transcending the idea and the power that gives you of freedom. And so I'm looking at these objects and kind of in my way, really respectfully transforming them, because this is just a gesture. It's just an idea. Like you can pray anywhere you want. You don't have to have a rug, So for those that are in the community of like, prayership and like religion, it's like, there's no harm or foul happening here. It's just an object, right? But the word itself for me is like, if I'm going to create this space with the visage of my own personal experience and the way that I see justice and the way I see, a reality to move forward, I'm going to look at protest posters specifically around demonstrations, where people were fighting for their sovereignty. And so I'm looking at the Grand Fury ACT UP posters, and I'm looking at like labor and race relation protest posters. And I'm kind of seaming those two worlds together, where you're praying for a better life, and then you have these protests that are praying for a better life. And so when I have something like I Am Muslima, I Am an Archive, Wait on History, Karaoke Spiritual Center of Love, there's like all these different titles I have. I'm as good as you are, I'm a body, like they become mantras. They become like these affirmations, or these ways in which you can kind of say those things and get yourself into a space where you feel like you can do this.
Yes, I think there's certainly a very slippery relationship between saying things, repeating things, and then embodying things. And we talk about, manifestation. That's become a sort of trendy word these days. But I think it's real also. I think that there's a way that we can speak things into being if we say them with a certain intentionality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an activity to the rug itself, right? You're getting to the rug that has this evocation to it. I agree with you, because I'm kind of a realist. I have 3 placements in Virgo. So like I could be pretty judgmental and hardcore. But what the point of the story is, like, I don't think that you can change your life by just words and just like saying something over and over again. I think it's about embodiment. You're right. You have to do about 3 different moves every single time in order to win, even on a chessboard. There's like 3 different streams of income that you need to make in order to be financially free. There's like, all this, you can't just do one thing, right? And so for me, it's like, I'm already sitting down on this rug with the intention to pray, and then fulfill that prayer on my own, because I'm saying, I want this, and then I'm going to try to figure out how to get it with the actions of my day-to-day. And then these words are there to remind me of my intention. That's kind of what I was getting at.
Yes. Yeah. That's a much more thoughtful way of putting things. And I'm thinking also about these works that we're looking at now, the acoustic sound blankets, which also have a very specifically situated relationship to the body and embodiment, but at the same time, you're covering yourself with them. And I don't know if we have any pictures of you wearing these, but it's okay. Maybe the image can live in people's minds. Not quite, but but almost.
Just Google my name, and unfortunately you'll learn more about me than I know about myself. So if you're curious about seeing images of that performance, there's stuff online. Yeah.
But anyways, the idea with these is you're wearing them, you're cloaking yourself inside of them, and kind of assume the power of opacity, which allows you to do whatever you want, and have fun and live inside of these objects, which in the museum setting, at least for me, I kind of read them as indices of your body, indices of those performances, even when they're hung on the wall and your body is absent. But how do you kind of regard the relationship between these works and the prayer rugs, which are both dealing with kind of themes of embodiment and performance, and also kind of index the body in these sort of in their installation?
the blankets are, I have to admit, the work I make is weird. Like they're weird gestures, and people keep saying yes. They keep saying yes. So you want to do this? You want to put parts of your body on a wall and climb it and make a drawing? Go ahead. Like you want to like get under a like a sound blanket and sound insulation blanket and make an album and then make fun of the crowd and like, sing to us? Go ahead. Like, so it's like I'm getting these invitations to do what I feel is necessary in these spaces. So, despite of what I've become and what I'm becoming, or like the idea of a person always becoming, I am very shy in a way, but I have the ability to step out of my body and do what needs to happen in any given moment, like whether it's teaching or helping someone on the subway, or getting under these blankets and performing, or being on a Zoom call with people I don't know, and chatting about my personal life and my artwork. Getting under the blanket enabled me to do something I'd always wanted to do, which is make music. And music for me is, everyone has their thing that suits them. And a lot of people have a relationship to music. I'm one of them. It has been the thing that's always centered me as a child. And, anytime things get really hard, I'll just put on my headphones and I can find a soft spot to just relax, which is very necessary, especially post-COVID. And so I wanted to, and the entire time from like day one, as a 1-year-old, I was constantly singing. I was just like singing, singing, singing. My family even recorded me singing, crying. Like when I would cry, it would sound like I was singing.
Wish I could
and
say the same.
Yeah,
Not
I
sound
mean,
like that
I
when I
never
cry.
yeah, I mean, I don't sound like I'm singing now when I cry, but so I would sing along. When I was in Texas, I would work. I worked at like music venues, and I was constantly around musicians. And when no one was around, I would play with their instruments, and I would go into the recording rooms. And then by the time like around 2014 comes around, Skowhegan invited me to be one of their residents in Maine. It's an artist residency, and they had recently had a donor grant them with a sound room. And this room was open 24 hours a day. Like you just had to sign up for it. So no one was signing up for it. So I was in there all the time, just like singing and playing with the equipment. And I would let people listen to the recordings, and they were like, wow, this is really special. Right. And so it gave me like limited amount of encouragement to keep going, to the point of where during the Brooklyn Museum exhibition, I was able to share a full album. It was a vibe, I'm not trying to be, Doja Cat or whatever, but like I wanted to create an album that was a vibe, because when I'm listening to music, I'm looking for a vibe. And I'm moving forward. And a lot of the initial fits and starts of me sharing what I can do to contribute with music was happening under the blanket, because as you said, once I got under it, no one could see me, so I could do whatever I wanted to do. And it didn't matter who was in front of me, because all I was doing was like in my present, and all I could see was myself. And so I was able to do a couple of things I would never do without the blanket.
I'm
Yeah.
also thinking about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to quickly say, and then I hadn't been under the blanket for a while. Georgetown University, this exhibition that just opened up, we're looking at some of the images. I was asked to get under the blanket. I didn't want to do it. So I kind of spontaneously get under the blanket for 20 minutes to do this performance for the community. And I noticed that it's a way for me to, like, there's a lot of visual things in our space, like even our shoes that we wear or whatever, there are these choices that we make. And sometimes we're not even making a choice, we're just buying something on sale that's comfortable. But I was able to like understand who a person was based on looking at their shoes in that room, because I couldn't see at you, but I could see your feet. And I was able to kind of like poke fun or like talk about a lot of like really hard topics, specifically within nonprofit, in the art world on university campuses under the blanket, because I was doing it in the gesture of having fun. And I think that that's what that blanket is doing, is it's like this, it's like a vessel or like a kind of like free spirit that's truly going into spaces and sharing the elephant in the room. And then I disappear and no one can really say, why did you say that? Because like I'm performing, you know? It's kind of like, it's the role of a comedian, because comedians are like the people who tell the truth in the room, and that's why they get so much flack.
Yes, right. And I love also that this spontaneous performance came out of a refusal of the institution's demands to get you under the blanket on their time.
Yeah.
You decided to do it on your own time and to make it your own, you know, your own thing, to reinscribe, you know, the agency that you have in this space that you've created for yourself and for your own articulations, which also reminds me of what you were saying earlier about words and language, which are another way to say what you mean and mean what you say, but you don't really have to be there to say it. You can just have the words. You don't need your body there.
Sure.
And the same thing is happening behind the blanket here, where you become absented, but your voice is very much there. And the things you want to say are very much there. Wow. Oh my gosh. I'm just looking at the time and there's so much more that I want to ask you.
Well, you got me, you know, you can always ask me off the schedule.
Oh boy. I certainly leave time for the audience to ask questions. But there's one more thing that I want to ask you about, which we haven't covered at all, which is your collage works. And those, I think, are on view in Cincinnati and at Georgetown. And I want to ask you about the role of archives in your work, and also the role of when you're taking your own photographs, many of which involve kind of, I don't want to use the word artifacts, but objects that museums have trained us to think of as artifacts. It's kind of difficult to see in this installation shot, but in some of these photos with the pink background, I believe you're kind of holding objects in your hand. So I wanted to ask you about
oh, you can show that green one.
Oh, great.
Yeah, these.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to ask you about how these archival objects, these objects from history, are putting a weight on history in these collages. Yeah.
I think it's crazy that I live in oil and water, because I think it's crazy that I get to have access to these really precious antiquities, and that there's a series of people who are signing off on saying like, we trust you, right? So on one sense, I feel blessed and like really lucky, but then there's a dark side to everything, right? So then I'm in front of these objects and I'm thinking about ancestral patterns and geographies and then like the sense of my own family's history, and then I don't quite have access to that history because of war and conflict, and it is heavy, because I'm this really sort of like in quotations successful artist in America, and I'm an embodied femme person, and I'm brown, and on some level, like, this couldn't happen to me anywhere else in the world. And I've lived it, and I know it. And maybe it couldn't happen anywhere else but New York, because New York is a very specific place. But when I'm looking at these objects and I'm holding them, and I have a list of ways that I can be around it. Like, sometimes you can't stand next to it. Sometimes you can only stand in front of it. Sometimes you have to wear neoprene gloves. Sometimes you can touch it with your hands, but only for 30-second intervals. And like, there's like a whole list of ways in which I can interact with something so powerful that's evoking all these feelings in me, right? And it's just confusing for me. So all that I can really do is, in a way, perform a kind of sense of care to these objects, knowing that I'm going to have to walk away from them, and that they're collected. They're, I don't want to say they're neglected, but like, in a way, when you don't get to experience, when everyone doesn't get to experience what I experience, it feels like neglect, in a way, because like, these objects are collected, they're stored, sometimes they're not verified because there's not enough information, and they're displaced from the communities that they come from, and it's just like, I think that I'm only able to give you bits and bobs of an answer because there's no answer. It's just a real feeling that I have when I'm in these spaces and I do the series of performances. And it's about negation, it's about presence, it's about never quite having a sense of ownership, but feeling the need to care because I'm right there in front of it. Yeah.
Yes, I think often about, we throw around this idea that curators and museums are in positions of caretaking, because curate comes from the Latin to care, da 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 da. But I think at the end of the day, it's really artworks like these that are exerting the kind of care, and practicing the kind of care that is deeply necessary, not only for these objects, but also for our kind of collective cultural sensibility, and our awareness of one another in the world. So it's 1:54, which is wild. I'm so grateful for this time that we've shared together, and this has just been energizing, in ways that I could sense from our conversation last week that this was going to be really fun, and it of course was.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this. This really has been wonderful, and I'm sure that the conversation will continue off screen at some point, or at least I hope it does.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah, but with that, I'm going to pass it to Carolyn and to the audience for Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for this conversation. If anyone does have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Our first one is from our friend GE. You can go ahead and unmute to ask.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Zoe. And thank you, Baseera. Could you talk a bit about the power of disruption for taking on these traditionally sterile and often white environments? And you seem to be doing it with such care and a kind of like radical softness.
Thanks for pointing that out. I think, well, I was a traditional painter. I was sort of a highly skilled painting kind of moving towards that way of being early on when I was in my 20s and 30s. But the thing that I noticed was that my voice was constantly body snatched, because there's, in a way, painting doesn't have a voice. That's the problem with the gaze, is that there's a lot of psychological things happening and people can just dump their voice into it. And so, there's a kind of level of lines of control when you have certain kinds of sculpture and performance. There's lines of control because the artist always speaks. And so I had to put a stop to it, because I think that there was so many things I didn't sign up for in the art world. And that's the point of the story, is that by the time I was knee high in the shit's eye of art, I didn't realize that I was signing up for like neoliberalism and like people who were like putting on faces and, all the stuff. Because I thought I was trading religion for religion. Like I thought I was trading out like one theological group for like art, which for me like was like very theological and heavy. And so I didn't have any other choice but to be a disruptor. And I think if you ever feel that I have a sense of care, it might be because I'm an Aquarian. And I'm not saying that as a joke, but I'm just saying it as like, I think I see everything. And I see that like even the worst person, I like have this tendency to empathize. And I think that that might be what you're feeling, is that I have a sense of care even for the worst thing, which is an institution. And I understand, because I actually was somebody who curated, organized, cleaned the bathrooms of, like fed, organized, like I did all of that for all these nonprofits. And then, here I am sitting, getting to be an artist, but I had all that history too. So I can't just occupy a space of the anti, because I'm implicit in it. And I think it would be a little bit, I think it's a little naive for any of us to think that we can just be anti. It takes a lot of courage, but it also takes a lot of nuance. And what I'm learning now is that because I have so much empathy, I have to protect my energy. And so that's something I'm doing. So I think that you're seeing something with care, but I think a lot of people who know me and who worked with me can also say like, she's mean. Because I think there's a level of like, I need to shut this off. Like I need some space. Like I can't always empathize.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Baseera and GE. Our next question will be from my colleague, Eleanor. Go ahead.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thank you so much, Baseera and Zoe. This has been such an incredible and juicy conversation. So much amazing things have been said. So I'm curious about, because Baseera, I know you're a poet as well, and you work with words. You work with words in some ways, and I'm just curious about your like inspirations in a text that come from text, and how you work with text and how text inspires your work, how you like use that in your like more visual centered practice.
Well, for any of you that are contemplating, grad school or higher education within the arts, one of the things that I didn't know I was doing, but I kind of was doing, was that in grad school, I went to Cornell University, mostly because they paid me to go to the school. And it was like, I got an MFA and then I was paid a small stipend to teach. And so it was great for me, right? It wasn't necessarily like the starfucker school, like it wasn't Yale or Columbia or like CalArts or whatever, but like it had something special for me. I was really interested in this idea of global aesthetics, which essentially is just like understanding colonialism and the decolonization process. That's basically what global aesthetics is. And so I just wanted to know why I was on this earth. And then if I found that out, then I could be the artist I wanted to be. And so though people were there and like highly skilled, they were like sculptors and painters, and you know, some of them were interested in photography. I kind of like didn't know what to do because I didn't want to paint anymore. And so I just went to the German studies department, the history department. I did art history, I did like Africana studies, indigenous studies. Like I would go to all these different departments and sit in on the classes and read their text. And then my council was comprised of non-artists, right? They were people from Africana study, like Salah Hassan and Iftikhar Dadi, who was art history. So he's technically art. So I was trying to seek counsel from people outside of the art world, but were technically arbiters of visual legacies based on understanding war. So it's because I read so much, and I wasn't a good reader. I actually had to, when everybody was going down the hill to the chapter house to drink beers and eat popcorn, I actually went away to a learning school where a lot of international students who didn't know how to speak and read English would go, because I had a learning disability. And I would like look at the text really big, and I would like learn how to read faster and like understand concepts faster. So for me, like having these small little like indices of learning disabilities has enhanced my way of thinking about visuality. So I have a strength, but the weakness for me at the time made me so paranoid. And so I read a lot, and I failed out of art school because I was reading so much. And I think it's through the process of doing all that. And like when you read a text and you come with all these notes, and then your professor tells you, how did you find that interpretation in this text? Like, you're not reading it right. And then I'm like, I'm not reading it right. I'm reading it. I'm the only one in the room that read it, you know? And so I found like a way of like, it's not poetry, but I found a way to like use words to explain like that feeling where like I might be interpreting it in my own idiosyncratic way. So let me write about that feeling. And that I've done it so much that now maybe I'm okay at writing. I mean, I guess some people would say I'm good at writing, but you know, that's kind of the answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I can be long-winded, so Zoe, please help me.
No, it's so generous.
I'm equally long-winded, and I also wanted to say sorry that many of my questions just roving all over the place.
No, not at all. This was a great conversation, yeah. Zoe. For me.
Me too, sincerely.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
There are additional questions in the chat.
I think that was it for questions. So I'm happy to turn things over to our closing poetry reading as per Rail tradition. I'm so thrilled to welcome Manal Kara here today. Manal Kara is a Moroccan-American self-taught artist. Recent solo exhibitions include Hypothèse at Plongée, Montreal, and Conjectures at Shulamit Nazarian, Los Angeles. They've attended residencies at Acre, Oxbow, September Spring at the Kesey Farm, Project Free Will, and Shindankin. They will have a solo exhibition this fall with Delhi Gallery, New York, and their debut collection of poems and drawings is forthcoming with M. LeBlanc Gallery, Chicago. Manal, thanks so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, and thanks to Baseera and Zoe for that conversation. That was really lovely. And thanks to the Rail for having me on again. I'm going to be reading off my screen. Sorry, that's a little corny, but here we are. All right, I'm just going to read straight through. I have just like 7 shortish poems. Here we go. The unintelligible acts of flesh made newly fungible, or is this not a transitive function? A fellow passenger waves a bodega bag's plastic rose in semaphore to foreclose any possibility that we could really do without a poetics of the interior. My fake roommates sit around the kitchen table, positing counterfactuals to trigger the release of dopamine. Returns diminish. Approach the glacier. There is more than enough here to turn the river against us. Let us first consider it as a distributed system. There are alluvial sites, my roommate begins through a cigarette, always merely the messenger. Silt is the preferred medium. If we wish to excise organic matter, a vacuum may be indicated. Consolidation as one form of madness. Consider the source, its propensity to contain what we call mortal. I recommend a more porous architecture. Christ redeems one token. So a piece of pollen walks into a dog. What a day. What a fantastic piece of meat, you say. Redeemer without a theologian, perhaps at random. In the air tonight, scarcely enough time for another grappa. Let them demon their own fortification, that I might see you better. Lush sunset, contrariwise, cranes its neck to appeal, and predetermined weapon to songs of pure reason. On his right piece of meat, there he is, the woeful theologian, tying his shoes in the corner for all the world to notice, eliminate matrix systematically, and cry out about his stilted notation. You can start horizontally. You may hesitate before reaching for a branch of hawthorn from which to break off an implement suitable for removing remnants of food from between your teeth. Blood mixes with saliva into a long, thin stream towards the ground. Having been born under the condition of always being a companion, I feel no anxiety in the absence of free will, but now I've run out of options. Scratch the same tick bite for weeks on end, like the scab itself needs dispatching. Percolating, bubbly, effusive, tearful, perky, intolerable, entrancing, vertiginous, lily orange. It will be sudden and unkind. It will be subtle and unmistakable on the twist of some clown mouth in the open sky. Jagged himbo uranium people breasts. Streets get hopeless to their essence, cold and color. All blood intellects of bellowing steel touch for it. Breath is barbarism. Shirtless milling, swing fog of jock straps for some bubbling behavior. The moral of cold life. Pure battle arouses window play. Give year back, we have sensed that lakes. Sex is merely palliative. Waiting to die is a common thing to do. I am not unlike soil. I found the counterfeit Xanax bar. Language disgusts me and makes me cry. There is no greater pleasure. Last one. This one's called Melanie. Riding the V-twin of her exegesis, I recall a time. I took all the precautions. What of a discourse in which the other is stricken wholly from the record? And when I was done, got in my truck and started driving. Had to stick my dick in milk. I swear I'll eat my whole country, mouth by mouth. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Manal. That was amazing. What a great way to end this incredible talk. Thank you, Zoe and Baseera and Leslie for today. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. Today's conversation will be up there shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a Rail poetry reading curated by Chime Lama. And you can now turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
What
Tara.
amazing.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Zoe. Hello.
Thank you. Hi, Fong. So good
Hi,
to
guys.
see
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.